I'm Louis Smith, Content Director of Berkeley Squares online newspaper, and today we're very happy to be joined by Colin Stuart, astronomer and author. So Colin, I'll start by asking what drew you to astronomy and what drew you to writing and speaking about it?
I've loved space since I was a kid. I don't really remember a time when I started loving it. It's always captivated me. I guess a lot of kids like space, but kind of grow out of it and they get distracted by something else. But I never did. And part of the joy of speaking about it and writing about it is that I can try and get other people excited too, because I think space is some of the best stuff that we do.
Well, I guess kind of building on that, lots of your time is spent encouraging children and young people to engage with space and science. So why do you think this is such an important mission?
I think it's because the space is really changing now. So far, about 550 people have been to space, ever, on a planet of 7.5 billion people. But that's really shifting. So people who are at school today, their future is in space. Their future is in the solar system. You're going to get to go to space as a tourist. The first people to go to Mars are at school right now. So space is becoming this. It's no longer a pipe dream for the people at school right now. It's a legitimate part of their future.
And so what advice would you give to a child who has dreams of becoming an astronomer? Or astronaut, I guess.
Yeah, I guess they're different. So to be an astronaut, it's never going to be your first job.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can go to university, study to be an astronaut, and then get into a graduate scheme and become an astronaut. That's not quite how it works. So they won't even look at you until you're in your 30s, because they want to see that you've picked up skills, that you have experience in something else first. So for an astronaut, the best thing to do is study. There's two ways you can do it. You can study science subjects, so that's science, engineering, maths, medicine, that sort of thing. Or you can go down the military route. So if you end up being so Tim Peake, for example, the British astronaut, was a helicopter test pilot first. So he left school at 18, joined the army, and went in that way. So yeah, either join the military or study sciences.
So I know your latest book is Traveller's Guide to Mars. What do you think the future holds for manned missions to Mars?
Well, not just manned missions. I guess we're trying to change that word now to make it human missions rather, because it kind of has that. Space has been very male dominated for a long time, and we're trying to make it more have more equality. And actually, they're talking about sending the first woman to the moon in the next 2024. They're saying. So the future is really bright. As I was saying in the talk today, Neil Armstrong was 38 when he walked on the moon for the first time, and people are talking about going to the moon, to Mars, even in 20 years, 30 years. So the first person to walk on Mars is between the ages of about 8 and 18 right now. So if you want to go to Mars and you're in that age bracket, then I'm too old. I'm the right age now, but we're not going now. We're going in 30 years. So.
But do you think you will ever get a chance to go to space, if not as an astronaut?
Yeah, well, if you cross what's called the Kármán line, which is a line that's 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface, you're an astronaut. You get your astronaut wings. You're not a professional astronaut, but you still get classed as an astronaut. And because space tourism is, in theory, coming, and the first flights might be in the next couple of years, yeah, I think I've got about 50-50 chance of going in let's say 30 years. If the cost is for a day trip £20,000, then I agree it's a lot of money, but it's not huge. People spend that on a car, on a maybe like round the world cruise, on some big once in a lifetime experience. So I've started a separate savings pot for that to see if I can get myself to space maybe 30 years from now.
And how do you feel about increasing automation, and how do you think the advent of AI and AGI will affect our relationship with space?
There's a debate. If we're talking about sending people to Mars, do you need to send people to Mars if robotics gets to the point where you have humanoid robots as a start, but if they're also artificial intelligence and they have make their own decisions, then that has the dexterity of a human, can pick up rocks and study them, and like a geologist could, then maybe you don't have to risk sending people to Mars, or the option is that one of the big dangers of the Mars trip is the landing, because you have to hit Mars really hard and then slow down so you don't smash into the surface. So maybe you go to Mars, you stay in orbit around the planet, and you control a robot right, in real time from orbit. And that sort of is a good halfway house there. You've got a real person controlling it without the risk of them being on the surface.
Okay, so apart from AI, what do you think is the most interesting or most relevant research happening in the field of astronomy currently?
That's a really good question. So if we talk about astronomy in general, then I think one of the huge breakthroughs in the last 5 years or so has been the discovery of gravitational waves. So these are ripples in the very fabric of space. So if you get two black holes colliding, for example, and smashing into each other, like dropping a stone into a pond, it will send out ripples. Now there are events in the universe that do not emit any light of any kind. So you can have all the telescopes you want. They can be optical telescopes, gamma ray telescopes, ultraviolet, X-ray telescopes. You're never going to see these events because they only emit gravitational waves. So the way I kind of compare it is, let's imagine that you grew up in a room and it was completely dark. And then someday someone came and gave you a torch and you had light for the very first time. You better shine that light around your room and see things you never knew were there. And that's kind of what gravitational waves are like. For the first time in 400 years, we have a new way of learning about what's out there in the universe. And I think the ramifications of that could be quite high as we build bigger and more sensitive detectors.
And so Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, has quite a worrying prognosis for our next century. Are you equally concerned, or do you have a more positive outlook?
Yeah, he's notoriously not very optimistic about the future. I mean, I can see where he's coming from. Humans are very complicated creatures. We have a pretty unique ability to be magnificent and ridiculous at the same time. Those two things aren't always mutually exclusive. So I like to think that we have the ingenuity and the imagination to science our way out of problems. But then you've still got to square it politically. You could have all the scientific solutions in the world, but if governments aren't pushing through those changes, then it might be useless. So I'm not as negative as he is. I'd like to think we have the smarts to do something about it, but I don't know, the way the world's going, it might not be the case.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's all the questions I've got. That's great.
Awesome.